Camille hurriedly paced the airport lounge, clutching her ticket and her old cell phone in her hands. She was late. "Mom, I'm thirsty," her son Matteo squeaked, rubbing his eyes. "Be patient, honey," she whispered, looking around for the right gate. She was tired. It had been a long day, her nerves on edge. She had the last of her money left to get home after a failed attempt to start a new life in a foreign city. Camille was a frail girl with dark brown hair gathered into a careless ponytail. Her eyes were brown, large but tired. Her dark jeans and beige sweatshirt looked shabby but neat. But here was the trouble, she couldn't find her way out. "Can I help you?" came a deep, pleasant voice. Camille turned around sharply and ran into deep blue eyes. In front of her stood a tall, elegant man, clearly used to expensive things. Dark hair slightly disheveled, light stubble accentuating his well-defined cheekbones. White shirt with the top button open, navy blue jacket, perfectly fitting pants. He was flawless. "I'm Dash," she was confused. "I'm looking for the gate to Flight 247. The man frowned, looked at the board. "This flight is delayed. And I think he's being transferred to another one." Camille froze. "But I need to get home. I don't have the money for a new ticket." The man looked at her carefully, then shifted his gaze to little Matteo. "How old are you, little one?" "4, the boy answered proudly, snuggling up to his mother. The man smiled, and something warm flashed in his eyes. "Listen," he said to Camille. "You'd better take another flight. It leaves earlier, and it will be more convenient." Camille frowned. "But my ticket? I'll buy you new tickets." She shook her head. "No, that's too much. Why do you want to help me?" The man sighed, as if struggling with an internal decision. "Because someone helped me in a similar situation once. And I want to pass it on." Camilla hesitated for a long time, but finally agreed. They went to the check-in counter together, and the man, whose name turned out to be Raoul, actually bought them tickets for a more convenient flight. "Thank you," Camille whispered as they made their way to the waiting area. "You're welcome," Raoul replied softly. But he didn't leave. He stayed close by, talking to Matteo, helping Camille with her luggage. Every time Camille furtively glanced at him, her heart clenched. Why would a man like him pay attention to someone like me? But when their eyes met, Raoul smiled. And in that moment, Camille realized this meeting was no accident. Camille sat in the waiting room next to Raoul, still not believing that this stranger with eyes the color of the ocean had just bought her and Matteo tickets. Why is he being so nice to me? What does he want? But when she squinted at him, there was no arrogance or hidden intent in his gaze. Just warmth and calmness. Matteo had already fully settled in. He sat in the cushioned chair, eyeing Raoul with curiosity. "Are you rich?" He suddenly blurted out, looking at the man's expensive watch. Camilla burst out in shame. "Matteo, you can't say that." But Raoul only smiled. "I guess you could say that." The boy clung tighter to his mother. "Then you're like a fairy tale. Like a prince." Camille felt her heart sink. Raoul shook his head, his smile a little sadder. "Princes are the perfect heroes. And me, I'm not perfect." Camille lowered her eyes. She wasn't used to kindness. The last few years had been a struggle. A struggle to get off her knees, to feed her son, to not break down. She remembered how she had been abandoned by Matteo's father, a rich, spoiled man who was afraid of responsibility. How she had stood in front of the landlady of her rented apartment for the first time, ashamed that she couldn't pay on time. How she worked nights as a waitress to pay for daycare. Are there really still people in the world who help for nothing? She turned to Raoul. "Why are you doing this?" He turned his head slowly, looking at her with a long, studying gaze. "Because," he hesitated, "I had a sister." Camille held her breath. Raoul ran his fingers along the arm of the chair, as if considering whether to continue. "She was a single mom too. I saw how hard it was for her, but I didn't have time to help Dash," his voice lowered. "She died." Camille froze. "I'm sorry," she barely breathed out. Raoul shook his head, but there was something vulnerable in his eyes. "I don't want anyone else to go through this alone." Camille didn't say anything else. She just looked at him, intently, deeper than before. And suddenly she felt that in this airport, among the crowds, she was no longer alone. Or maybe this wasn't just a flight. It was the beginning of something more. Raoul exhaled slowly and lowered his gaze, as if deciding whether to continue. "She was my little sister," he said finally. "A very bright person. You would have been friends with her." Camilla listened with bated breath. "She got pregnant too soon," he continued. "Her boyfriend disappeared when he found out they were having a baby. And I was too busy at the time, working around the clock, building a career. I thought money would solve everything, that if I just made more money I could help." He grinned sadly. "But I was wrong. She didn't need money so much as she needed support. I realized that too late." Camilla felt her heart clench. She knew the feeling of waiting not for a handout, but for someone to say, "You'll be fine, I'm here for you." "What happened to her?" she asked cautiously. Raoul ran his hand over his face, as if erasing a memory. "She got sick. Cancer. When they told me there was no hope, I wanted to buy her the whole world. But at that moment she just needed someone to be there for her." He clenched his palm into a fist, as if trying to control his emotions. "I was with her the last few days. And you know what she said to me?" Camille shook her head. "Live, Raoul. Live so that you won't regret wasting your time." The silence between them was almost palpable. Camille slowly covered his palm with hers. "You're a good man, Raoul." He smiled sadly. "And you're a strong woman, Camille." She shrugged. "You have to be strong when you have no choice." Raoul looked at her carefully. "But you have one now." They were silent, but it was a warm silence. Raoul was the first to break the silence. "What are you dreaming about?" Camille laughed. "The usual things. That Matteo would be healthy. That we have a house where the roof doesn't leak." She sighed. "And also," she hesitated. "Tell me," he asked softly. She shrugged. "I used to dream of being an artist." Raoul raised his eyebrows. "Really?" She smiled, a little embarrassed. "Yeah. I've been drawing since I was a kid. But then life, work, a baby. It's in the past." Raoul looked at her carefully. "You can still draw, can't you?" Camille grinned sadly. "In this world, you can't just take up art when you have a baby to feed." Raoul leaned closer. "Maybe you just need someone to remind you that dreams are important." Camille felt something inside her tremble. "Do you?" she asked. "Are you happy yourself?" Raoul hesitated. "I don't know. I have money, I have power. But sometimes I look at people who are just walking in the park, laughing with their children, and I think that maybe they are much richer than I am." Camille smiled and their eyes met. And in that moment, they both realized they had met each other for a reason. Camille looked at Raoul, catching herself thinking that she was at ease with him. Too comfortable. And that was frightening. She wasn't used to trusting men, especially not men like him, wealthy, confident, used to getting whatever they wanted. But he's not like the others. Maybe he's just a good man? Maybe his kindness is genuine? It was as if Raoul had read her mind. He smiled slightly and covered her palm with his. "I don't know what will happen next, Camille. But I do know that right now I don't want to leave." She stared at his face. Sharp cheekbones, thick dark hair, light stubble. He looked as if he'd stepped off a glossy cover, but there was something different in his eyes, not pride, not self-confidence, but warm sincerity. Camille felt her heart beating faster. But she still had her doubts. "Raoul, why are you doing all this?" He exhaled, as if preparing to answer a question he hadn't asked himself yet. "Because I see something in you, something I once lost." Camille frowned. "What?" Raoul smiled sadly. "Faith in people." She froze. Those words hit something inside, something she herself had tried to ignore for years. Have I really stopped believing in people? She remembered all the disappointments, all the promises made but not kept. But next to him, it was different next to him. Matteo slept peacefully, snuggled against her shoulder. Camilla looked at her son and felt Raoul watching her. "He's wonderful," he said quietly. Camille nodded, stroking the boy's hair. He's the only thing I have. Raoul looked at her warmly. That's not true. She turned to him in surprise. Now you also have me. Camille froze, afraid to believe what she was hearing. She didn't know how to react. What if he doesn't leave? If he really stays? The thought was too new, too frightening, but so warm at the same time. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, she didn't need to be alone. Camille was silent for a long time, digesting Raoul's words. Now you also have me. Why does he say that? Why does he do all this? She wanted to ask, but she couldn't. Something inside kept her from believing that this man, handsome and confident, could just show up in her life. Raoul, noticing her confusion, smiled softly. Do you think I'm just saying that? Camille flinched at how accurately he had guessed her thoughts. She lifted her gaze and looked into his eyes. I'm just not used to this kind of thing. Raoul nodded as if he understood. I know. But you said yourself that life is unpredictable. Maybe she's just trying to get us together. Camille lowered her eyes, pulling Matteo closer. I don't want him to get used to someone who will then disappear. Raoul took a deep breath and took a step closer. I'm not going to disappear, Camille. She shook her head, fighting her emotions. How could you possibly know? Raoul laughed softly. I just know. And in that moment, Camille realized he was being honest. She didn't know how it would end, but for the first time in a long time, she wanted to believe. Camille sat in the airport cafe, keeping her eyes on the cup of tea she'd never started drinking. Thoughts raged in her head. Raoul sat across from her, watching her carefully. There was no pressure in his eyes, only patience and understanding. You're afraid, he said calmly. Camille clenched her hands into fists. Of course I'm afraid. I can't afford to make a mistake. Raoul leaned closer, his voice softer. Do you think I want to hurt you? Camille looked up at him. I think life has already shown me too many times that you can't trust. Raoul nodded, accepting her words asterisk. I'm not asking you to believe me right away, but I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that I'm different. Camille grinned embarrassedly. You sound so confident. Raoul smiled lightly. Do you know why? Because when I saw you for the first time, I realized I didn't want to just pass you by. He took her hand in his, squeezing her fingers warmly. Camille, you deserve more than just fighting to survive. You deserve to be happy. She felt something inside her shudder. What if I really try? Outside the window, dusk was thickening, the light of the airport growing softer. Camille looked at Matteo, who was sleeping peacefully in his chair. She looked at Raoul. His kind eyes, the confidence in his voice, on a man who really didn't seem like he had any intention of leaving. She took a deep breath. Okay, she finally said. I'll give you a chance. Raoul smiled, and there was something warm in his eyes. You won't regret it. And somehow Camille felt that he was telling the truth. When Camille said those words, she felt her heart clench in fear, but at the same time a flame of hope flared in it. She'd given him a chance. Raoul smiled, but something else flashed in his gaze, a realization of responsibility for her trust. Thank you, Camille, he said quietly. I won't let you down. She nodded, but her fingers were still nervously tugging at the edge of his sleeve. I don't know what to do next, she admitted, barely audible. Raoul squeezed her hand gently. We'll figure it out. Together. At that moment, a voice came over the speakers announcing the boarding of her flight. Camille stirred as if waking from a dream. She was supposed to be on a flight back to her normal life. But now, Raoul watched her, taking his time to answer. You can come with me, he suggested, not as a whim or an impulse, but so that we could try to see where this story would take us. Camilla froze. Go with him? It was all too sudden, too fast. She looked at Matteo, who was still sleeping peacefully. What if this is the chance I've been dreading? She inhaled, looked up at Raoul, and finally made her choice. Camille stood hesitating, staring at the boarding announcement. Her suitcase was beside her, doubts raging in her mind. She was used to fighting alone, to counting only on herself. Now there was a man standing in front of her, offering her something more. Raoul didn't rush her. He just watched, waiting for her decision, letting her choose her own path. Camille took a deep breath and turned to him. "If I go with you, what then?" Raoul smiled warmly. "What happens next is whatever you want it to be. I don't promise a fairy tale, but I promise you won't be alone anymore." Those words touched something deep in Camille's soul. She lowered her gaze to Matteo, who was rubbing his eyes sleepily, then looked at Raoul again. And for the first time in a long time, she decided to take a chance. "Okay," she whispered. Raoul froze, as if he didn't immediately believe her words, and then his face lit up with joy. "You won't regret it, Camille." He took the suitcase, squeezed her hand with confidence, and they walked away from the boarding area together. She didn't know what lay ahead. But one thing was certain, it was a whole new path. Camille felt her heart pounding in her chest faster than usual. She had just made a choice that could change her entire life. Raoul paced beside her, squeezing her palm tightly, and the feeling, it was unfamiliar. "I really did it. I trusted someone again." Matteo woke up, yawned, and looked sleepily at Raoul. "Where are we, Mom?" He mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Camille froze, not knowing what to say, but Raoul smiled. "We're going home, buddy." The boy nodded uncertainly and clung to his mother again. Camille felt something inside her shudder at his words, at how naturally he said, "home." Raoul got them into the spacious, expensive car and sat behind the wheel. Camille stared out the window as the city whizzed by. "You didn't ask where we were going," he said abruptly. She smiled at the corner of her lips. "You're right, but somehow I'm not scared." Raoul took his eyes off the road for a second, looked at her, and smiled again. "Then you do trust me?" Camille sighed. "I'm willing to give it a try." She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, a calmness spilled inside. Maybe this really is my chance for a new life?